They were told the Americans would execute them, line them up and shoot them like dogs. But when 156 German women stepped off the trucks at Camp Florence, Arizona on November 3rd, 1945, and saw American soldiers handing them shovels, they knew their time had come. "They're making us dig our own graves," Greta whispered, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the wooden handle. The women began to sob, their tears falling into the dry desert soil. But then something impossible happened. The American guard smiled and said words they would never forget. "Ladies, we're planting a vegetable garden. You're going to grow your own food." What happened next would completely destroy everything these women believed about their enemies, about war, and about their own place in the world. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These true accounts from World War II reveal the humanity hidden beneath the horror. Let's begin. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a flat expanse of sand and scrub brush under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. November brought relief from the scorching summer heat, but the sun still beat down mercilessly at midday. The dust rose in clouds as the convoy of military trucks rumbled down the dirt road toward Camp Florence, a prisoner of war facility that had been hastily constructed in the middle of nowhere. Inside the canvas-covered trucks, 156 German women sat in silence. They ranged in age from 19 to 54. Most had served as nurses, clerks, radio operators, and support staff for the German military across Europe and North Africa. Now they wore whatever clothing they had managed to keep: torn Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, civilian dresses stained with months of wear, boots with holes in the soles. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow. They had eaten little on the long journey from the East Coast, partly because there wasn't much food, partly because fear had stolen their appetites. Greta Schmidt, 28 years old, sat near the back of one truck, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been a field nurse with the Afrika Korps, tending to wounded soldiers in the brutal desert campaigns of North Africa. Beside her sat Ingrid Hoffman, 23, who had worked as a radio operator in France. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had spent the entire journey preparing themselves for death. The trucks came to a stop with a grinding of brakes and a final cloud of dust. The canvas flaps were pulled back and harsh sunlight flooded in, making the women squint and shield their eyes. American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms clean and pressed, their faces impassive. The heat hit them first. Even in November, Arizona was far hotter than anything most of these German women had experienced. The air was dry, sucking moisture from their throats with every breath. The smell of dust and creosote bushes filled their nostrils. Everything felt alien and hostile. Beyond the trucks, they could see the camp, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with barbed wire. Guard towers rose at the corners, silhouettes of armed soldiers visible against the bright sky. But the camp looked different from what they expected. It wasn't a concentration camp. It wasn't even particularly threatening. It looked almost ordinary, almost temporary, like something built quickly and without malice. The sound of English commands rang out, crisp and authoritative. The women didn't understand most of the words, but they understood the tone. Efficient, professional, not cruel. Not yet. They climbed down from the truck slowly, their legs stiff from hours of sitting, their hearts pounding with terror. "Stay together," Greta whispered to the women near her. "Whatever happens, we stay together." Her voice shook despite her attempt to sound brave. She had seen what war did to prisoners. She had heard the stories. Every soldier knew what happened when you fell into enemy hands. Torture, starvation, execution. That was the way of war. That was what they had been taught to expect. An American officer approached, flanked by two guards. He was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes that didn't match the hard set of his jaw. Behind him walked a woman in a U.S. Army uniform, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. A translator. The translator spoke in German, her accent American but understandable. "Welcome to Camp Florence. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly and humanely. You will be given housing, food, and medical care. No harm will come to you as long as you follow camp rules." The women stared at her in disbelief. Geneva Convention? Fair treatment? These were words that made no sense in the context of what they knew about war. Ingrid leaned close to Greta and whispered, "It's a trick. They're lying to make us compliant before they kill us." Greta wanted to believe Ingrid was wrong, but she had stopped believing in miracles 2 years ago when she watched men die in the sand, when she saw the futility and cruelty of war up close. Why would their enemies be any different from their own commanders, who had sent them to die for nothing? The women were led into a large building that smelled of antiseptic and soap. Medical examination rooms lined both sides of a central hallway. American nurses, all women, waited in crisp white uniforms. Their faces showed neither hatred nor pity, just professional calm. "You will each undergo a medical examination," the translator explained. "This is to check for injuries, illness, and malnutrition. The nurses will treat any conditions they find. You will also be given clean clothing after you shower." Shower. The word sent a chill through every woman in the room. Showers, gas chambers. They had heard the rumors about what happened in the camps back home. They had heard whispers of Jews being told they were going to shower, only to be murdered with poison gas. Was this the same? Were the Americans using the same methods? Greta felt her breath quicken. Her hands went cold. She looked at Ingrid, whose face had gone white. Neither woman moved. Around them, other women began to cry softly, the sound building like a wave. One of the American nurses noticed the fear. She stepped forward and spoke to the translator in English. The translator turned to the German women and said, "The nurse wants you to know that you're safe. This is a real shower, hot water and soap. No gas, no harm. She says she understands why you're frightened, but she promises on her honor that you will not be hurt." On her honor. An enemy promising on her honor. Greta didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but there was no choice but to comply. One by one, the women moved forward for their medical examinations. The examination was thorough but gentle. The nurses checked vital signs, looked for signs of disease or injury, and documented everything on clipboards. Greta flinched when the nurse touched her arm, expecting pain. Instead, the nurse smiled and said something in English that sounded reassuring. She pointed to a scale. Greta stepped on it. The nurse frowned at the reading and made a note. Too thin. Far too thin. After the examination, Greta was directed to the shower room. She walked in with a group of other women, all of them moving like people going to their execution, slow and resigned. The room was tiled, with multiple shower heads along the walls. Bars of white soap sat on small shelves. The women undressed in silence, shame and fear mixing together. Greta turned the shower handle, barely breathing. Water came out. Just water. Hot water, not gas, not poison, just water. She stood under the stream and felt tears mixing with the water on her face. Around her, other women were doing the same. Crying, laughing, some just standing in shock as months of grime washed away. The soap smelled like flowers. Clean, simple, real. Greta scrubbed her skin until it turned pink, washing away not just dirt but also layers of fear and despair. For the first time in months, she felt almost human again. But the feeling came with guilt. How could she feel relief when her country had lost? How? Could she enjoy a shower when German cities were in ruins? After showering and dressing in clean cotton dresses provided by the camp, the women were led to a dining hall. Long tables filled the room, each one set with plates, cups, and utensils. The smell of cooking food hung in the air. Bread, meat, vegetables, real food. The kind of food they hadn't seen in years. "Please sit," the translator said. "Lunch will be served shortly." The women sat, stiff and uncertain. Greta's stomach growled despite her fear. She hadn't eaten anything substantial in days. The rations on the ship from Europe had been minimal, and before that, Germany itself had been starving. American soldiers in kitchen whites appeared, carrying large trays. They moved down the rows, placing plates in front of each woman. Greta stared down at her plate and felt her throat close up. Roast beef, thick slices of it, still steaming. Mashed potatoes with butter melting in a golden pool. Green beans. A roll with a pat of butter. A cup of coffee. A glass of milk. This was more food than she had seen on a single plate in 3 years. This was more food than most German civilians would see in a week. And it was sitting in front of her, a prisoner, someone whose country had just lost the war. Nobody moved. Nobody ate. They just stared at the food as if it might vanish or transform into something terrible. Finally, an older woman named Hannah, who had been a hospital administrator, picked up her fork with a shaking hand. She cut a small piece of beef, lifted it to her mouth, and chewed slowly. Her eyes closed. Tears rolled down her cheeks. That broke the spell. Women all around began to eat. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others ate quickly, desperately, as if the food might be taken away. Greta bit into the roll and tasted butter, real butter, not the margarine made from coal they had been eating in Germany. The bread was soft, fresh, perfect. She chewed and swallowed and felt the food hit her empty stomach like a blessing. But with every bite came guilt, crushing, unbearable guilt. While she sat here eating roast beef, her family in Hamburg was eating whatever they could find in the rubble. Her mother was probably boiling potato peels to make soup. Her younger sister was likely going to bed hungry every night. And here sat Greta, the prisoner, eating better than she had eaten even before the war. Across the table, Ingrid was crying so hard she could barely swallow. "This is wrong," she whispered. "Everything about this is wrong. We're prisoners. We should be punished. We should be starving. Why are they feeding us like this?" Greta had no answer. Nothing made sense anymore. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, vengeful, hateful. But these Americans were doing something far more confusing. They were being kind. And somehow that was more terrifying than any punishment. After the meal, the women were shown to their barracks. The buildings were simple but clean. Wooden structures with rows of beds, each one with a mattress, pillow, and 2 blankets. Footlockers sat at the end of each bed for personal belongings. Windows lined both sides of the building, letting in desert light and air. "These are your quarters," the translator explained. "You will be responsible for keeping them clean. Linens will be changed weekly. You may arrange your personal items however you like." Personal items, as if they had anything left. Most women had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Greta chose a bed near a window and sat down slowly. The mattress gave under her weight, soft and real. She pressed her hand against it, testing, still not quite believing. A bed, with blankets, in a prisoner of war camp. Everything they had been told about American cruelty was turning out to be lies. But that realization brought no comfort, only more confusion and fear. The next morning after breakfast, oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with jam, coffee, the women were assembled outside. An American officer stood before them with the translator. Behind him, several soldiers held shovels, rakes, and other tools. The officer spoke, and the translator relayed his words. "Ladies, part of your work here will be to help maintain the camp gardens. We have a plot of land behind the barracks where we grow vegetables. You will help prepare the beds, plant seeds, and tend the crops. The food you grow will supplement your meals and the meals of the camp staff." The soldiers began handing out shovels. Greta took one, her hands suddenly ice cold despite the desert heat. Around her, women were accepting shovels with looks of pure terror. They were being given shovels, digging tools, in a desert prison camp. The horrible realization spread through the group like wildfire. "They're going to make us dig our own graves," someone whispered behind Greta. "This is it. This is how it ends." The whisper grew louder, spreading from woman to woman. "Mass graves. They're making us dig mass graves. They're going to line us up and shoot us." Women began to sob. Some dropped their shovels and fell to their knees. Others stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think. Greta felt her own tears start to fall as she gripped the shovel handle. After everything, the food, the showers, the beds, this was the trick. This was the trap. They had been fattened up only to be slaughtered like animals. The cruelty of it was almost poetic. The American officer's face changed when he saw the women crying. He looked confused, then concerned. He said something quickly to the translator, who looked equally confused. Then understanding seemed to dawn on both their faces. The translator stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Wait, no, you misunderstand. You're not digging graves. You're preparing garden beds for vegetables. Look." She pointed to a cleared area behind the barracks where several rectangular plots had already been outlined with wooden borders. "Garden beds. For tomatoes, carrots, lettuce. You will grow food to eat. That's all." The women stared at her, unable to process the words. Not graves? Gardens? The American officer knelt down, picked up a handful of dirt, and made exaggerated motions of planting seeds and watering them. He smiled and said something in English. The translator repeated in German, "He says gardening is good work. Peaceful work. You will enjoy growing things instead of destroying them." Slowly, painfully, the realization sank in. They weren't going to die today. They were going to plant vegetables. The relief was so intense it felt physical. Women who had been kneeling in the dirt stood up shakily. Those who had dropped their shovels picked them up again. Some laughed through their tears, the sound high and slightly hysterical. Greta looked at the shovel in her hands and then at the garden plots. Garden beds. Not graves. Just gardens. She had spent the last 2 years surrounded by death, destruction, and cruelty. She had seen men die by the hundreds. She had lived in constant fear. And now her enemy was asking her to plant vegetables. The work began slowly, awkwardly. The American soldiers demonstrated how to turn the soil, how to create raised beds, how to prepare the ground for planting. They worked alongside the women, not as guards and prisoners, but as fellow gardeners. One young soldier showed Greta how to break up clods of dirt with the back of her shovel. He smiled at her and gave her a thumbs up when she did it correctly. As the morning wore on, something strange happened. The physical labor felt good, therapeutic almost. Digging in the earth, feeling the sun on their backs, working with their hands to create something instead of destroy it. For the first time in years, these women were doing something peaceful, something life-giving. They were planting seeds that would grow into food. They were creating, not destroying. By lunchtime, several garden beds had been prepared. The women's hands were dirty, their backs ached, but there was something different in the air. Not happiness exactly, but maybe the first tiny hint of peace. That afternoon, they would plant seeds, tomatoes, beans, carrots, lettuce. They would learn to care for the plants, to water them, to watch them grow. The irony was not lost on anyone. While Germany lay in ruins, while their families starved in bombed cities, they were planting gardens in the Arizona desert. The days at Camp Florence took on a rhythm that felt almost surreal in its normalcy. Wake at 6:30 a.m. to the sound of a bell. Breakfast at 7, always substantial, always more than they needed. Work assignments at 8 lot. The women were divided into groups. Some worked in the gardens, others in the camp laundry, some in the kitchens helping to prepare meals. The work was light compared to what they had done during the war. Nobody shouted at them. Nobody beat them for working too slowly. Lunch at noon, then more work until 4 p.m. Dinner at 5:30. Free time in the evenings to read, write letters, or simply sit and talk. Lights out at 10 p.m. Every single day the pattern repeated. Orderly, peaceful, almost boring in its predictability. And with every passing day, the contrast with their old lives grew more painful. Letters from home arrived sporadically. Greta's first letter from her mother came 3 weeks after her arrival. The paper was thin and poor quality, the handwriting shaky. The words tore at her heart. Hamburg is destroyed. Our neighborhood is gone. We live in a cellar with 6 other families. We eat once a day if we are fortunate. Usually boiled potato peels and bread made from sawdust. Your sister coughs blood. There is no medicine, but we survive. That is something. Greta read the letter 3 times and then couldn't eat dinner that night. She stared at the meatloaf and potatoes on her plate and saw her mother's hollow face, her sister's bloody cough. She pushed the plate away and went back to the barracks. But she was not alone. Every woman in the camp was receiving similar letters, desperate accounts of starvation, homelessness, disease. The guilt became unbearable. They were gaining weight. Their cheeks filled out. Color returned to their skin. They looked healthier than they had in years. Meanwhile, their families were dying. The disconnect was maddening. How could they be prisoners and yet live better than free citizens back home? How could the enemy be feeding them while their own people starved? Ingrid started having nightmares. She would wake up screaming about her brothers, who had died on the Eastern Front, about her parents in Dresden, whose letters had stopped coming after the firebombing, about the guilt of being alive and well-fed while everyone she loved suffered. Other women had similar nightmares. The barracks echoed with crying most nights, but the routine continued. Breakfast, work, lunch, work, dinner, sleep. The gardens grew. Tiny green shoots pushed up through the soil. The women watered them, weeded around them, watched them grow with something close to wonder. Creating life in the desert, growing food. It should have felt good. Instead, it felt like a betrayal. It was the small moments that began to crack their carefully maintained walls of hatred and fear. Moments so small they seemed insignificant, but somehow changed everything. Greta was working in the garden one afternoon, pulling weeds between the tomato plants when she noticed movement from the corner of her eye. An American guard was approaching. She tensed, expecting orders or correction. Instead, he knelt beside her and pointed to a plant she had been about to pull. "No, no," he said in English, shaking his head with a smile. He made gestures to indicate that this was not a weed, but a tomato seedling that had self-seeded. He carefully transplanted it to a better spot, showed her how to distinguish young vegetable plants from weeds, and gave her a thumbs up. Then he walked away, whistling. No anger, no impatience. Just a man teaching another person how to garden better. Another day, one of the kitchen workers, a young German woman named Elsa, accidentally dropped a tray of dishes. The crash echoed through the mess hall. Everyone froze. In Germany, such clumsiness would have resulted in a beating or at least a furious tirade. But the American cook just laughed, helped Elsa pick up the pieces, and patted her on the shoulder. "Happens to everyone," he said in English. The translator repeated it in German. "Happens to everyone." As if mistakes were normal, forgivable, human. The most powerful moment came in December. Winter had arrived, and even the Arizona desert grew cold at night. The women shivered in their barracks, their thin blankets barely adequate. One morning, the camp commander appeared with a truck full of additional blankets, thick wool blankets, 2 for each woman. "Winter provision," the translator explained. "The commander noticed you were cold." He noticed. The enemy had noticed they were cold and brought them blankets. Greta sat on her bed holding the thick wool blanket and cried. Not sad tears, but something more complicated. Because she was remembering the winter of 1943 in Hamburg, when her family had burned furniture to stay warm because the government had requisitioned all the coal for the war effort. She remembered her little brother's blue lips, her mother's frozen hands, and here was the enemy, bringing her blankets because he noticed she was cold. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything they had been taught about Americans, that they were cruel, heartless, inferior, was proving to be lies. Every day brought new evidence that the propaganda had been false. These Americans were not monsters. They were not even particularly cruel. They were just people doing their jobs, treating prisoners according to rules, showing basic human decency. And that basic human decency was more destructive to their worldview than any torture could have been, because it forced them to ask terrible questions. If the Americans were not the monsters they had been told, then who were the real monsters? If the enemy showed more care for their well-being than their own government had, what did that say about the cause they had served? Greta lay awake most nights, staring at the dark ceiling of the barracks, her mind trapped in circles that had no escape. During the day, she could distract herself with work. The garden was thriving now. The tomato plants had grown tall and were beginning to flower. The lettuce was ready to harvest. The work of tending growing things gave her hands something to do, but it couldn't quiet her mind. She thought about her years serving the Reich. She had believed in the cause, or at least she had told herself she believed. She had worked as a nurse because nurses were needed, because serving was honorable, because it was her duty. But what had it all been for? Germany had lost. Millions were dead. Cities were rubble. And for what? For nothing. For lies told by men who had never cared about her or anyone like her. She pulled out her mother's letters and read them again by moonlight. The descriptions of starvation, cold, disease. And then she looked around the barracks at women sleeping peacefully in real beds with warm blankets. She thought about the 3 meals a day, the medical care, the basic dignity they were afforded. Prisoners. They were prisoners of war, and they lived better than free German citizens. The betrayal she felt was not toward America. It was toward Germany. Toward the leaders who had lied to her, used her, and then discarded her. Toward the propaganda that had painted the enemy as monsters when the real monsters had been the ones giving the orders back home. The realization was like a physical pain in her chest, making it hard to breathe. But acknowledging that betrayal meant acknowledging that everything she had sacrificed had been for nothing. That the men she had tried to save had died for nothing. That her own suffering had been meaningless. That truth was almost impossible to bear. So most nights she lay awake, trapped between the person she had been and the person she was becoming, unable to fully let go of either. The other women were fighting the same battle. Some clung desperately to their old beliefs, insisting that the Americans were only being kind because of the Geneva Convention, that it meant nothing, that they were still the enemy. Others had begun to openly question everything they had been taught. Most, like Greta, existed somewhere in the painful middle, unable to move forward or go back. The debates started quietly but grew louder as weeks passed. In the evenings, women gathered in small groups in the barracks or outside near the gardens, trying to make sense of their situation. The arguments were heated, desperate, necessary. Hannah, the oldest woman in the camp, insisted they maintain their loyalty. "We are still German," she would say firmly. "Nothing these Americans do changes that. We were soldiers. We served honorably. That matters." "But what were we serving?" Ingrid shot back one night, her voice bitter. "We served a government that sent us to die for a madman's dreams, that starved its own people to feed a war machine. That lied to us about everything. The Americans feed us better than our own government ever did. They treat us better than our own officers treated us. What does that tell you about who we were really serving?" "It tells me that the Americans follow their laws," Hannah replied. "The Geneva Convention requires proper treatment of prisoners. They're not being kind. They're following rules." "But they could interpret those rules differently," a young woman named Clara said quietly. She was only 22, had worked as a clerk. "They could give us minimum rations and call it adequate. They could house us in tents and call it shelter. But they give us real food, real beds, real care. That's more than following rules. That's humanity." "Humanity from people who dropped bombs on our cities?" Hannah challenged. "Who killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians? Don't mistake enforced civility for virtue." The point hit home. It was true. The same country that gave them blankets had also firebombed Dresden, had destroyed Hamburg, had killed German civilians by the hundreds of thousands. How could both things be true? How could a nation be capable of such destruction and such mercy? Greta spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. "Maybe that's exactly the point. They can do both. They can wage total war and then treat their prisoners with dignity. That's not weakness, that's something else. That's the ability to separate the war from the individual, to see us as people, not just enemies. Germany never did that. We were taught to see everyone as either part of the Reich or against it. There was no middle ground, no mercy for enemies, no humanity across battle lines. The conversations continued night after night. Generational divides appeared. Older women who remembered Germany before the Nazis were more willing to question. Younger women who had grown up with the propaganda struggled more. Some women stopped participating in the debates, unable to face the questions. Others became obsessed, arguing until exhaustion forced them to sleep. But beneath all the arguments was a simple truth that everyone felt. They had been lied to, and the lies had cost them everything. The breakthrough came slowly, like dawn breaking over the desert. It wasn't a single moment, but a gradual accumulation of realizations that built until they could no longer be ignored. The Americans weren't just following rules. They were demonstrating a philosophy, a way of seeing the world that was fundamentally different from what these German women had known. Democracy. The word had been used as an insult in Germany, portrayed as weak and chaotic. But watching the Americans, Greta began to see what it actually meant. It meant that even the lowest-ranking soldier was treated with a certain dignity. It meant that officers didn't beat subordinates for mistakes. It meant that systems existed to protect even enemies, even prisoners, because individual human rights mattered more than national identity. In Nazi Germany, your worth came from your service to the state. You existed to serve the Führer, the Reich, the cause. Individual desires, individual needs, these were selfish, unimportant. The collective was everything. But here, in this prisoner of war camp in the middle of the Arizona desert, the Americans were treating them as individuals with inherent worth, regardless of their service to anyone or anything. The gardens became a symbol of this philosophy. Every seed planted represented a choice to create rather than destroy, to nurture rather than conquer. The women tended their plants with increasing care, watching tomatoes ripen, harvesting lettuce, pulling carrots from the earth. The work was simple but profound. They were growing food. They were creating life. After years of being part of a machine of death, they were doing something peaceful and good. One afternoon, Greta was picking ripe tomatoes when the full weight of the transformation hit her. She held a tomato in her hand, warm from the sun, and realized that this single tomato represented everything they had gotten wrong. They had been taught that power came from domination, from forcing others to submit. But the Americans were showing them a different kind of power. The power to choose mercy, to treat enemies with dignity, to maintain humanity even in war. This was what had defeated Germany. Not just superior weapons or resources, but a superior idea. The idea that every person had value. The idea that even your enemy deserved basic rights. The idea that victory didn't require cruelty. Germany had embraced brutality and called it strength. America had chosen restraint and called it civilization. And in the end, civilization had won. The recognition was devastating and liberating at the same time. Devastating because it meant everything they had believed was wrong. Liberating because it meant there was a better way, a way that didn't require dehumanizing yourself or others. That night, Greta wrote in a journal she had started keeping. We thought we were fighting for strength, for the survival of our people. But we were really fighting for the right to be cruel. And we lost not because we were weak, but because cruelty is always weaker than humanity. That is the hardest truth to swallow. The moment of complete transformation came on a clear January morning. The gardens were thriving despite winter. The women had learned to protect the plants from frost, to harvest before the temperature dropped too low at night. The vegetables they grew had become a point of pride. The camp commander had praised their work, said the gardens were the best he had seen at any POW camp. Greta was working in the garden when one of the American guards approached. He was carrying a box. "For you," he said through the translator. "The commander wanted you to have these." Inside the box were seed packets, dozens of them. Flower seeds, marigolds, zinnias, sunflowers. Not vegetables, flowers. Purely decorative, beautiful, completely unnecessary for survival. Greta stared at the seed packets, unable to comprehend. Flowers. In the middle of a war. In a prisoner of war camp. The guard smiled and gestured to the edge of the garden, indicating they should plant the flowers there as a border. Beauty. They were being encouraged to create beauty. Not just food for survival, but beauty for its own sake. She fell to her knees right there in the dirt, the seed packets clutched in her hands, and sobbed. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside her. Because she understood now. Completely and fully understood. This was the difference between the world she had known and the world she had discovered. One world saw people as tools, resources to be used for national glory. The other saw people as ends in themselves, worthy of beauty and dignity even in defeat. The guard looked alarmed and called for the translator. "What's wrong? Did I upset her?" The translator knelt beside Greta and asked in German, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" Greta looked up at them through her tears and tried to explain. "Flowers," she managed to say. "You're giving us flowers. We're prisoners. We're German. We lost the war. Our country tried to destroy yours, and you're giving us flower seeds so we can plant beauty. Don't you understand how impossible that is? Don't you understand what that means?" The translator relayed this to the guard, who looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned on his face. He said something in English, which the translator repeated in German. He says that's what we do. We're Americans. We plant gardens even in the middle of wars. We believe in beauty and hope and second chances. He says you deserve flowers too. You deserve flowers too. Those words shattered the last walls around Greta's heart. She had spent years believing she was a cog in a great machine, that her worth came from her usefulness. But these Americans were saying something different. You deserve beauty simply because you're human. Not because you've earned it, not because you're useful, just because you exist. That evening she gathered the women of the barracks and told them about the flower seeds. Some women cried, others smiled for the first time in months. They made plans for where to plant them, how to arrange the colors, when to start the seeds. The conversation was animated, almost joyful. They were planting a garden of flowers, not food, not something practical, just beauty. And in that planning, in that simple act of choosing beauty, they completed their transformation. They were no longer the women who had arrived terrified and beaten. They were no longer loyal servants of a failed Reich. They were becoming something new. People who understood that humanity transcended nationality, that dignity was not earned but inherent, that even enemies could show mercy, and that mercy was the strongest weapon of all. In the spring of 1946, news came that repatriation would begin soon. Ships were being prepared to return German prisoners to Europe. The women should have been overjoyed. They were going home, back to their families, their country, their language. But instead, the announcement brought dread and anxiety. I don't want to go back, Ingrid confessed one night. The words hung in the air, shameful and true. What kind of person does that make me? Germany is my home. My family is there. But the thought of leaving this place, of going back to the ruins and the starvation and the chaos, I'm terrified. She wasn't alone. Conversations in the barracks revealed that many women felt the same way. They had come to prefer captivity in America to freedom in Germany. Not because they had forgotten who they were, but because basic human needs, food, shelter, safety, dignity, mattered more than abstract concepts of national loyalty. Greta stood in the garden one last time, looking at the plants they had grown, at the flowers now blooming in cheerful borders around the vegetable beds, marigolds, zinnias, sunflowers reaching toward the desert sky, beauty they had created, life they had nurtured. She touched a tomato plant gently, like saying goodbye to a friend. I learned something here, she said to Ingrid, who stood beside her. I learned that the world doesn't have to be cruel, that we don't have to dehumanize people to survive, that there's a better way. Will we be able to remember that? Ingrid asked quietly. When we go back to Germany and see what's been done, what was lost, will we be able to hold on to what we learned here? Greta didn't have an answer. She could only hope. The ship journey back to Europe took 3 weeks. The conditions weren't as comfortable as the camp, but they were treated with basic dignity. Regular meals, clean water, medical care if needed. When the German coastline appeared on the horizon, the women crowded the rails to see their homeland. What they saw broke their hearts. Devastation. Complete and total devastation. Cities reduced to skeletal ruins. Harbors clogged with sunken ships. Coastlines scarred by war. They disembarked at a processing center where they were given minimal rations and released to find their own way home. Greta made her way to Hamburg by train, watching the destroyed landscape roll past the windows. Where there had been towns, now there was rubble. Where there had been forests, now there were burned stumps. Germany looked like the end of the world. Her family was living in the basement of a bombed building. Her mother had aged 20 years. Her father coughed constantly from breathing brick dust. Her sister was skeletal, her eyes too large in her thin face. When they saw Greta, healthy and well-fed, their joy was immediate but complicated. You look well, her mother said carefully. The Americans must have treated you fairly. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. You were eating while we starved. You were safe while we suffered. Greta wanted to explain, but how could she? How could she tell her starving family that she had been treated better as a prisoner than they had been as free citizens? How could she describe gardens and flowers and kindness without sounding like she had betrayed them? So she said nothing. She just held her mother and cried. The years passed. Germany rebuilt itself, slowly transforming from ruins into a new nation. The occupation ended. Democracy took root. Greta found work as a nurse in a hospital, using skills she had learned during the war and refined in Arizona. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate herself to healing. She kept a small garden on her balcony where she grew tomatoes and flowers. Marigolds, always marigolds. She rarely spoke about her time as a prisoner of war. The shame was too deep, the contradictions too painful. But she passed on what she learned in other ways. She treated every patient with dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. She taught young nurses that every person deserves respect. She volunteered with refugee organizations, helping people displaced by later conflicts. In the 1970s, when her niece was studying World War II in school and came home with questions about what it was like, Greta finally told her story. She told her about the terror of thinking they were digging their own graves, about the shock of discovering they were planting gardens, about learning that the enemy could be more humane than your own people, about flower seeds that taught her what mercy really meant. The Americans didn't win because they were stronger, Greta told her niece. They won because they had a better idea of what it means to be human. They showed us that you can be powerful without being cruel. That victory doesn't require dehumanizing your enemy. That's the lesson I learned in the Arizona desert, and it changed everything about how I see the world. And so the garden beds, those rectangles of turned earth that the women had feared were graves, became something far more powerful. They became symbols of transformation, of the moment when fear turned to understanding, of the discovery that enemies could show mercy, and that mercy could change hearts more effectively than any weapon. For those 156 German women, the shovels they had been handed represented the moment their entire worldview collapsed and reformed. They had expected death and received life. They had expected cruelty and received kindness. They had expected to be treated as enemies and were instead treated as human beings worthy of dignity and even beauty. The flower seeds they planted in the Arizona desert bloomed not just in soil, but in their understanding of what humanity could be. Every marigold was a reminder that even in the middle of war, even between enemies, beauty and compassion could survive. Every tomato they harvested was proof that creation was stronger than destruction. As Greta said years later to her niece, they gave us shovels and we thought we were digging our graves. Instead, we were planting seeds of a better future. That's what mercy looks like. That's what real strength is. Not the power to destroy, but the power to choose kindness even when you don't have to. These women discovered that the most dangerous weapon America possessed wasn't bombs or bullets. It was the simple, radical belief that every human life has inherent worth, that dignity transcends nationality, and that treating your enemies with humanity doesn't make you weak. It makes you victorious in a way that outlasts any military conquest. That is a story worth remembering. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. These true accounts from World War II reveal uncomfortable truths about war, about humanity, and about the power of simple mercy. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Leave a comment telling us what you think. And remember, the past has powerful lessons for us if we're brave enough to listen.